The still room smelt of beeswax and dried lavender, and the light that fell through its single narrow window in late October was the colour of the honey itself, amber, thickening, reluctant to move. Maria Oakridge stood at the long oak table with her hands steady on a frame of comb, pressing the last of the wax caps into place with the flat of her thumb. It was the work her hands knew without her mind's direction, and she was grateful for that, because her mind was elsewhere. Tallying the rent, calculating whether the last of the Michaelmas quarter's yield would cover the glazier's bill, or only the rent. Deciding not to decide yet. She had 42 years on her, and most of them had been spent in rooms like this one, small, useful, fragrant with the work of her own hands. The cottage had been the orchard keeper's house when her father managed the land for the late Earl, and after his death it had simply continued to be hers, by a combination of quiet tenacity and the county's general disinclination to disturb a woman who delivered babies competently and kept the best honey in 3 parishes. No one had offered to improve her situation, and she had long since stopped expecting them to. What she had, she tended. What she could not mend, she learned to use anyway. The gown she wore was grey. Not fashionably grey, but simply grey in the way of fabric that has been washed too many times and is making the best of things. She had darned the left sleeve twice and the hem once, and she wore it as she wore every other fact of her life, without apology and without theatre. On her right hand, the skin between thumb and forefinger was thick from the hive tool. Her hair, dark once and now shot through with silver, was pinned with a practical efficiency that owed nothing to style. It was into this quiet, this amber-smelling industry that her niece Lucy arrived at a run. The door banged open, and 17-year-old Lucy Ashford, her sister Delphine's youngest, her dark hair coming loose from a morning cap she had evidently clapped on in haste, arrived at the threshold with the particular breathlessness of someone carrying news she believed would rearrange the world. Which, as it happened, it would. "Aunt Maria." She stopped, caught her breath, and said it again as though the name itself were the announcement. "Aunt Maria, he's come back." Maria did not look up from the frame. "Close the door, Lucy. The cold turns the wax." Lucy closed the door. She crossed the small room and stood on the other side of the table, close enough that Maria could see the flush in her cheeks, and the brightness in her eyes that belonged to excitement rather than cold. She had Delphine's colouring, and none of Delphine's calculation, which Maria had always considered the girl's great fortune. "Did you hear me? He's taken Eastmere. They say he came up from London last Thursday in a post-chaise with 4 horses, and the whole village turned out." She paused for effect. "It's Mr. Roland Ashby, Aunt. He's the Duke now. The new Duke of Eastmere." Maria pressed the cap into place. Then she lifted the frame carefully, held it to the window to check the seal, and set it in the tray with the others. She wiped her thumb on the cloth tucked at her waist. She said. Lucy stared at her. He was... You knew him, didn't you? Before? Mother said. Your mother says a great many things, Maria said. Not sharply, but with the finality of a door that has been politely closed and latched. She moved to the next frame. Did you walk all this way through the wet lane to tell me the district has a new duke? I thought you'd want to know. I do know. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it on Wednesday. This was not entirely true. Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned the post-chaise and 4 horses, and had not given the name, but it was true enough to serve. Thank you for coming, my love. You may take that pot by the door, the darker one, that's the late-season heather, for your mother's larder. And tell her I'll come by Thursday. Lucy took the pot with the obedient resignation of someone who has recognised the door being shut, but cannot bring herself to stop pressing it. At the threshold, she turned back. "Are you quite well, Aunt?" Maria's hands were already on the next frame. "I am always well," she said. "Go home, Lucy. The lane will be mud before midday." The door closed. The still room returned to its amber quiet. Maria stood at the table with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the frame in front of her, and she did not move for the span of perhaps 20 seconds. Then she drew one breath through her nose, slow and deliberate, and she capped the next frame with her thumb. And the next. And the next. And she did not stop until the work was finished. Mrs. Hester Combe appeared at the garden gate an hour later, picking her way through the wet grass with a basket over one arm and the careful dignity of a woman of 78 who refuses to be assisted and requires no one to know she has considered it. Maria saw her from the kitchen window and went to meet her at the gate. "I've brought eggs," Mrs. Combe said, without preamble. She was a small woman, dried to something dense and durable by decades of hard weather, with white hair under a black bonnet and eyes that missed nothing. 6 brown and 2 white, the brown are fresher. "You're kind, Hester." Maria opened the gate and took the basket. "Come in and have something warm." They sat at the kitchen table over weak tea and the good shortbread Mrs. Combe had slipped under the eggs, as she always did, and always affected not to have done. The kitchen was cold, the fireplace holding only the grey suggestion of embers, a single log not yet lit. Mrs. Combe looked at it and said nothing. That was part of the understanding between them. "I suppose you've heard," Mrs. Combe said. "About the Duke?" "Yes." "The boy's come back a general, or near enough, so they say." The old woman wrapped both hands around her cup. "I remember when he was 19, and the late Duke's nephew, and he used to ride through the lower pasture without by your leave, and never opened a gate he could jump. But that was before the war made everything else." She was quiet a moment. "They say Northwind's in a terrible state. The late Duke let it go to ruin. The roof in the library has been leaking 3 years. The home farm half fallow. Tenancies not collected since Easter 12-month. Old Soames is still steward, if you can call it that." Her mouth compressed into a thin line that contained a full account of what she thought of Mr. Soames. "The new Duke will have a fine time of it." "He will," Maria said. Mrs. Combe looked at her steadily. "You are not afraid of him coming back?" It was not quite a question. "I see no use in fear," Maria said. "A man returning to his inheritance is not a catastrophe." "No," said Mrs. Combe after a moment, "but it is something." She did not press the matter further, which was the other part of the understanding between them. She spoke of her grandson Thomas, now 3 months old and reportedly possessed of a fine pair of lungs, and of the lower field drainage, and of the miller's horse losing a shoe on the Coventry road. When she left, she pressed Maria's hand at the gate with both of hers, briefly, firmly, and said nothing. And Maria stood watching the small black figure pick its way along the lane until it turned the corner at the elm. The cottage had 4 rooms: the kitchen, the still room, the bedroom under the eaves, and the room she did not call a parlour because it was too plain to justify the word, but where she kept her books and her chair and the things she could not bring herself to sell. It was here she stood now, in the grey afternoon, with one hand resting on the shelf above the small fireplace. Cold, swept clean of ash that morning, and let her eyes move over the objects that constituted, in their small way, the record of a life. Her mother's china occupied the highest shelf. 4 cups and a slop bowl. The pattern a blue willow rubbed thin at the rim of every cup from 50 years of hands. One cup had a hairline crack running from handle to base, mended not with any elegance, but with ordinary paste that had dried hard and yellowed. and it held its tea without complaint, which was all that was required of it. Her mother had brought the set from her own mother's house, and her grandmother had received it as a wedding gift from a family that no longer existed in any form she could have recognized, and the cups had survived, all of them. On the table by the window sat her father's copy of Parkinson's Paradisus, the botanical plates foxed and the binding cracked at the spine. And pressed between pages 212 and 213, the columbines, was a piece of meadow cranesbill. Pale purple once, now brown and papery, no larger than a child's palm. She had pressed it there herself at the age of 19, walking back from the lower meadow in the last summer that had been ordinary before it became extraordinary, and then devastating in the space of a season. She did not open the book to look at it. She never did. She simply knew it was there, the way one knows the shape of a room in darkness, and that was sufficient. She moved back to the still room, checked the tray of sealed frames, carried 2 jars of summer honey to the shelf by the door, where they sat waiting for tomorrow's trip to the market at Ashwick. 2 jars. The lesser would cover the week's butter and flour, and the finer, the late-season heather, dark and a little sharp, the one she had nearly sent with Lucy before thinking better of it. That was for the rent. 2 jars to hold a cottage together for another fortnight. She was not ashamed of this precisely, but she was exact about it, the way a surgeon is exact about the length of a wound, without sentiment, without theatre, with the simple precision that useful work requires. At dusk, she sat on the orchard step. The apple trees stood stripped now, the last of the windfalls taken, the grass long and wet with the afternoon's drizzle. The air smelled of cold earth and the distant smoke of the Coombe Farm's evening fire. Above the tree line, the sky was a dimming bronze green, the last of the October light reluctant to leave, the way it always was at this hour, in this season. As though October understood what November was, and preferred not to hurry the introduction. 20 years ago, it had been almost exactly this hour, this light. She had been standing in the lower meadow below the orchard, where the path ran between the willows, and Roland Ashby, not yet the Duke, not yet the soldier, not yet the man of weight and consequence he would become, had taken her hand and turned it over and pressed his lips to her palm and held them there. The world has consisted entirely of that point of warmth against her skin and the sound of the bees working late in the willows above them and the bronze-green sky going slowly dark. She had been 22. He had been 24. She had not yet received the letter from Delphine. He had not yet left for the continent. She had thought, in those 20 years since, that she had ceased to feel the memory, that it had become a fact rather than a wound, a date in a ledger, entered and closed. Sitting on the orchard step, with her hands in her lap and the cold seeping through the stone, she discovered this assessment had been somewhat optimistic. But it was one thing to discover the wound, and another to give way to it. She allowed herself one tear. It spilled from the corner of her left eye and ran along the line of her jaw, and she caught it with her sleeve, roughly, the worn grey serge of the thrice-mended gown. And then she sat with the cold air and the bronze light and the fact of it, and she let the fact settle into the same ledger with all the other facts, and she closed the entry. She would not run. There was nowhere to run to, and she was not, in any case, a woman who ran. She would not hide because she had nothing to be ashamed of, and she knew it. And because hiding would require a performance of fragility she neither felt nor cared to manufacture. When the meeting came, and it would come because a new duke in a district this size makes its rounds, and she was too well known to be skipped, she would receive him as she received every other fact of her existence, without apology and without theatre. She had built a life here. It was a small life, honest and purposeful, and it did not hinge on his return. That was the thing she was most certain of. Whatever Roland Ashby had become across 20 years of campaigns and loss and inheriting a title he had not expected, it was not her concern. And his arrival was not a door she was obliged to open. The question she could not yet answer was whether she would manage to keep it closed once she saw his face. She rose from the step and crossed to the hives, running her hand along the Hessian wrap of the nearest skep, feeling the faint warmth of 10,000 small lives still working in the dark. Then she bolted the still-room door, went upstairs to the cold bedroom and lay down in her coat because the fire had not been lit since Tuesday, and she stared at the low ceiling until the dark became complete. Somewhere on the other side of the hill, behind the tree line, the windows of Northwind Hall were lit for the first time in 3 years. He did not come the next day, or the day after that. Maria had expected it, the formal call, the Duke paying his respects to the district's near gentry, the machinery of social obligation grinding through its motions, but 3 days passed, then 5, then a full week, and the gate at the end of the cottage lane remained unlatched only by the wind. She told herself she was relieved. She almost believed it. She occupied those days as she occupied all her days, in motion, in use. The hives needed their winter preparation. The last of the season's comb needed rendering down. Old Mr. Taft's leg wound, which the surgeon in Coventry had dressed inadequately and billed exorbitantly, needed her attention 2 mornings running, and she rode the 4 miles on her elderly mare Duchess. The irony of the name had always amused her, faintly, with her kit bag strapped behind the saddle and the lanes running grey and cold beneath a sky the colour of pewter. She was useful. She was known. She kept moving. It was on the 9th morning, while she was cutting back the dead stems at the end of the kitchen garden, that she heard the hoofbeats on the lane. She did not turn immediately. She finished the cup she had started, set the stems in the basket, and then straightened and turned, with a basket of broad beanstalks on her hip, and the cold pruning knife still in her right hand, and 3 years of orchard clay on her boots. She supposed later that she could have gone inside. She supposed later that she had chosen not to, and that the choosing had been deliberate in ways she had not yet fully admitted to herself. Roland Ashby, the Duke of Eastmere now, and that title sat on him like a coat cut for a larger man that he had grown into over years she had not witnessed, dismounted at the gate and walked the last 20 feet on foot. He was taller than she had remembered, or perhaps the military bearing made him appear so. A straightness through the shoulders, a stillness in his movement that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a man who had learned not to waste motion in places where motion cost lives. His coat was dark, well cut, the cravat precisely knotted. His hair had gone grey at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes she did not recognise, and the eyes themselves were the same colour as 20 years ago, and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. She did not curtsy. She gave him a nod, the kind of nod one neighbour gives another on the lane, and waited. "Mrs. Oakridge," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, and steadier. "Your Grace." A small pause. "The lane was good riding, I hope. The ruts at the elm corner are worse than they look." Something moved in his expression. "They are," he said. "I managed them." He looked at the garden, at the basket on her hip, at the pruning knife, at all of it. Not intrusively, but with the attention of a man cataloguing a place that matters. "I should have called sooner. I have been," a slight pause, "occupied with the estate." "So I have heard," she said. "Northwind will keep you busy. The lower drainage alone will be a season's work if Soames hasn't let the channels entirely silt." She said it not as a jab, but as plain fact, the kind of remark she would have made to anyone about any property she had observed at a distance, which was the more unsettling for it. He looked at her steadily for a moment. You have been watching the estate. I have been watching the district. It is not the same thing, though the overlap is considerable. She adjusted the basket on her hip. It was good of you to come, Your Grace. I hope you will find the county agreeable. Every sentence a door, closed politely. He recognised it. She could see that he did, from the slight alteration in his stillness. But he did not press against any of them, and she did not open any. And after a few more exchanges of the sort that pass between people who are saying nothing in well-chosen words, he lifted his hat, remounted, and rode back down the lane. She went into the still room and stood with her back against the wall and both hands flat against the cold plaster. And she waited with great patience for the shaking in her hands to stop. It took longer than she would have preferred. Lady Sibylla Ashby had been 79 for the last 3 years to anyone who asked, and 91 to anyone who actually knew. And she had long since ceased to make any distinction between what she preferred to be true and what was merely actual. She received Maria in the yellow drawing room at Northwind 6 days later, a room in which every surface was covered in dust sheeting except for the 2 chairs she had uncovered herself and the small table between them on which a tea tray had been placed with the precision of a woman who believes the correct arrangement of teacups is a moral matter. The rest of the room existed behind its white coverings like the shapes of furniture in a dream, recognizable, dimensionless, faintly threatening. The smell was damp plaster and cold hearth ash, and something older underneath. The specific melancholy of a house that has been inhabited for generations and neglected for years, where the accumulated absence of warmth has settled into the walls themselves. At the far end of the room, 2 dogs lay on the cold stone of the unlit hearth, a liver-spotted hound of considerable age, and the younger terrier that regarded Maria with one eye open. "You are exactly as I remembered," Lady Sibylla said, which was not a compliment in the usual sense, but which Maria understood to mean, "You have not diminished yourself, and I have noticed." She was a small woman, her spine still astonishingly straight, her eyes sharp and dark and missing nothing, her hands folded around a cup of tea, with the delicacy of someone who has handled very fragile things for a very long time, and knows the precise pressure required. A cameo brooch at her throat, ivory and jet, a woman's profile, was the one piece of jewellery she wore, and it looked as though it had been at her throat for 60 years, which it had. "You remember me, my lady," Maria said carefully. "I am flattered." "Don't be. I remember everyone. It is the curse of living this long, one accumulates an archive." She set down her cup. "I am told you know the tenancies. Coombe Farm, Taft, the 3 along the Coventry Road. Soames has sent me accounts that do not agree with one another." "They would not," Maria said. Lady Sibylla looked at her. "No, I thought not." A pause, precisely timed. "I am also told you have some understanding of estate drainage and roof repair." "A general understanding. Enough to read a building survey and know when a figure has been inflated." "Splendid," said Lady Sibylla, with the satisfaction of someone who has placed a chess piece where she wanted it to go and is now affecting not to have done so. "You will come on Wednesday, the estate room at 10. My nephew will be present. He has asked for an independent opinion on the Soames accounts, and I have suggested yours." She phrased it as a done matter. Maria looked at her steadily across the tea tray, and Lady Sibylla returned the look with serene, ancient composure. And neither of them said anything about the reason behind the reason, because neither of them needed to. "Wednesday," Maria said, "at 10. The estate room at Northwind was everything the drawing room was not: functional, cold, and currently in a state of administrative chaos that told a coherent story to anyone willing to read it. The long table held 3 separate stacks of ledgers bound in cracked calfskin, a roll of tenancy surveys that had not been unrolled in some time, a pile of receipts that had been sorted into groups and then apparently abandoned mid-sort, and a bottle of ink so depleted that Soames had been using it with the addition of water, which was evident in the quality of the entries, which were thin and grey where they should have been black. Mr. Soames himself, compact, florid, possessed of the defensive confidence of a man who has been doing something dishonest for long enough to have convinced himself it has become ordinary, stood at the far end of the table and greeted Maria with a courtesy that was, she noted, calibrated precisely to the level of a woman he did not expect to trouble him. Roland was already there when she arrived. He stood by the window, the one that overlooked the kitchen garden, its frames swollen with damp and painted shut 3 winters ago, the paint cracked in the corner where the plaster had shifted, and he watched her come in with the same unreadable stillness as before. He gave her a nod. She returned it. What followed was 2 hours of the kind of work she had done alone in the district for years, without ledgers or formal appointment, the work of reading numbers against reality, of checking the survey of the library roof against Soames's receipt for repairs that could not have been carried out for the figure listed, since Maria had walked past the library on her way from the gate, and the lead flashing was still buckled in 2 places and green with 3 winters' growth. She laid the survey flat, placed the receipt beside it, and set her finger on the discrepancy, without dramatics. Soames objected. He objected in the way of a man who had been objecting to scrutiny for years, and had developed a range of techniques for it. The baffled bluster, the technical counter-argument, the appeal to complexity. Maria listens to each one with the patience she brought to anything intractable. And then she returned to the numbers, and the numbers did not change. Roland, who had been listening from the window, crossed to the table and looked at what she was pointing to, and then looked at Soames, and Soames looked at the carpet. And that was the end of Mr. Soames in the employ of Northwind Hall. After Soames had been escorted from the room by the under-butler, a young man named Perkins, who managed the task with the carefully neutral expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular morning for some time, the estate room was quiet. Maria was returning the ledgers to their proper order, which was a task she had begun because she could not quite stop being useful, and Roland stood on the other side of the table with his arms folded and watched her do it. "You would have made a formidable officer," he said, quietly. It was not a careless compliment. She aligned the spine of the last ledger with the others before she answered. "Someone had to mind the ground while you were winning your battles." The word battles settled into the silence between them and stayed there. She did not look up. He did not look away. The word carried more than its military meaning, and they both knew it. And neither of them moved to correct the record, and after a moment she set the ledger straight, and he unfolded his arms, and the morning went on. The lane between the south garden and the lower meadow was not called the Golden Lane by anyone officially, but it had been called that as long as Maria could remember, because in autumn the willows that arched over it turned a particular shade that the morning light intensified, and in that light the lane looked like something out of an old painting, not quite real, too luminous to be accidental. She walked it in the late afternoon of the following Thursday, returning from her survey of the Coombe Field drainage, when she heard his footsteps behind her on the gravel. He fell in beside her without preamble, the way 2 people who have been walking the same ground for years manage, despite having only been doing it a fortnight. They had been speaking for some time about the lower field, about the Taft tenancy, about the question of the home farm's fallow acreage, before the conversation shifted, in the way conversations shift when the practical matter has been settled and the real one surfaces beneath it. "I had a letter," Roland said, "in the spring of 1795, from a man I trusted." Maria kept walking. Her pace did not change. "It told me," he continued, "that you had formed an attachment, that you had asked for the understanding between us to be considered at an end." She stopped. The willows were very still around them. After a moment, she turned to look at him. "I received a letter," she said, "in the autumn of that same year. It was in a hand I recognized." She said the next part with the precision of someone who has held a fact a long time and is choosing, deliberately, to set it down. "It told me you had written, through an intermediary, to say you had formed a connection abroad and considered yourself released." Roland looked at her. The light in the lane was gold and cold and very still. "I wrote no such letter," he said, "through any intermediary." "I know that," Maria said. Now. She had reached this conclusion somewhere in the estate room, going over the old papers. A letter among the North Wind correspondence, written in a hand she had not recognised and filed under the wrong year, which referred in passing to a communication dispatched to Miss Oakridge, and the dates and the language of it had arranged themselves in her mind into a shape she had been unable to dismiss, though she had tried. She knew who had written it. She had known, perhaps, for longer than she had admitted to herself, because there was only one person whose advantage it served, and whose handwriting she would have recognised at 22, even when it was disguised, because she had grown up in the same house, and learned to read at the same small desk. She had not yet said Delphine's name aloud to him. She would, but not yet. The fact of it was too new and too old at once, like a bone long healed wrong, and she needed to hold it a moment longer before she spoke it into the open air. Roland was watching her face, and she could see in his that he was moving through his own reckoning. The particular face of a man who has been carrying a wound he thought self-inflicted, and is only now understanding the cut came from elsewhere. "Maria," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. She looked at him across 20 years of silences and misreadings and separate griefs, and the golden light held, and the willows did not stir. What would he say next? What would she answer, now that the clean, hard fact of the forgery lay between them, not yet spoken in full, but legible to them both? They had found the truth. The question, standing in that lane with the autumn light going slowly gold around them, was what either of them intended to do with it. She said the name quietly, the way one names something that has been present in the room for some time and simply not yet acknowledged. "Delphine." Roland held very still. The willows made no sound. "My sister," Maria said. Not an explanation. He knew who Delphine was. A precision. She was clever enough to disguise her hand and not quite clever enough to disguise her motive. "I have known it, I think, longer than I have allowed myself to know it." She looked up at the sky above the willows, which was cold and clear and offered nothing. She wanted the Ashby connection for herself. She has always wanted the largest available version of whatever she could obtain. A pause. She did not succeed in that, either. She married Henry Oakridge, my cousin. He is moderately prosperous and thoroughly deceived. "The man in the letter," Roland said, "the supposed intermediary. His name was Fairwood. I trusted him because he had served alongside my father." The lines around his eyes deepened. "I should have come to you directly. You were 24, and you had received a letter that appeared to release you from an obligation." She turned to look at him again. "I was 22, and I had received a letter that appeared to do the same. We were both obedient to what we believed was the other's wish." A short silence. The letters were the only things in that whole arrangement that were faithless. He looked at her for a long moment, the face she had not seen for 20 years, and which was now overlaid on the remembered version, both true both present. Then he said, "I have no right to ask you anything," and she could see from the set of his jaw that he was going to ask regardless. And she found she did not object to that. "No," she said, "but ask." What passed between them in the Golden Lane was not a grand declaration. It was a conversation, careful, honest, conducted in the plain language of two people who have each survived a long time and have grown past the habit of ornamentation. He asked. She thought. She said she would not give him an answer that evening, because she did not make decisions in the full flood of a revelation, but that she would think, and that she respected him enough not to make him wait very long. She did not wait 3 days. She was by nature a woman who, once she had resolved to do a thing, saw no utility in prolonging the resolution. She sent a note. He came. She said yes, with her hands around a cup of tea and her eyes steady on his. And if there was something in her chest that moved when he took her hand, she kept that particular fact to herself. They were married before the first hard frost. The Reverend Ashworth at St. Clement's performed the ceremony with becoming brevity, attended by Lady Sibylla, who wore the cameo brooch and a black coat that had belonged to 3 funerals and 1 wedding and was equal to all of them, and by Perkins, the under-butler, who had been included in the party because someone needed to hold the register. Lucy came, with red eyes that could not settle on whether they were joyful or bereft. Mrs. Combe, who had not been invited, and who therefore arrived at the church door at 10 minutes to the hour, and positioned herself in the back pew without addressing the question of invitation at all, sat with her hands folded and watched the proceedings with the expression of someone witnessing an outcome they had correctly predicted and feel no need to announce. Maria wore a gown of dark green wool, altered at the waist and bought 3 years ago for a purpose she had since forgotten. She carried 3 stems of late-season rosemary from the cottage garden because she had been going to pick a formal arrangement and then had not, and the rosemary was what was left, and it would do. When the ring was placed on her finger, plain gold, his grandmother's, which Lady Sibylla had produced from a velvet bag without comment, the metal was warm from being held. She did not look back at the cottage as the carriage carried them up the hill to Northwind. She had locked the door and given the key to Mrs. Combe to use as she saw fit, and that was that. The house was large, in the way that carries a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of emptiness, but of space that has been occupied by grief and has not since been reordered. The entrance hall smelled of cold stone and extinguished candles, and the particular stillness of rooms that have not been adequately used for years. Dust sheeting covered the furniture in the main drawing room, the blue salon, the morning room. Pale shapes like furniture in a dream, all edges and no warmth. The portrait gallery ran the full length of the south wing. 24 ancestors in gilt frames looking out from their canvases with the settled indifference of people who have been dead long enough to be comfortable about it. The library ceiling had a water stain in the northwest corner, brown and spreading, shaped roughly like a country she could not identify. The dining room table seated 22 and sat at the centre of the room as though it had been placed specifically to emphasise the distance between any 2 people who might sit at it. In the kitchen passage, a row of iron bells hung silent on their springs. Someone had labelled each bell's rope in careful copperplate. Drawing room. Library. Blue salon. The label on the last rope read simply, His Grace, in a hand so old the ink had gone russet. The servants were 7, not counting the stable hands. Perkins, now butler in practical terms if not yet in title. 2 footmen named Thomas and William, who were cautious in the way of people not yet certain whether the new arrangement would require them to change their habits. A cook, Mrs. Ogilvy, stout and competent and prepared to be friendly if given any encouragement. A scullery maid of 16 named Poll, whose mother was ill in Coventry and who had been crying at intervals for a fortnight. And the housekeeper, Mrs. Burnett. Mrs. Burnett received Maria in the linen room on the second day, which was not where a housekeeper would ordinarily receive a duchess. And Maria had understood this as a test, and had passed it by not appearing to notice. She was 50, Mrs. Burnett, with iron grey hair and a face that had settled into its permanent expression, which was the face of someone who has learned to expect very little and has organised her inner life around that expectation with great efficiency. She wore a plain black dress and a chatelaine at her waist, a worn silver chain from which hung a dozen keys of varying sizes, each one the specific key to something specific, each one worn smooth at the bow from years of handling. The keys clinked softly when she moved. She was not hostile precisely. She was withheld. There is a difference, and Maria knew it, and did not take the withholding as a door to be forced. Instead, she asked Mrs. Burnett about Poll's mother. Then she asked about the state of the linen cupboard, not as an inspection, but with the genuine curiosity of a woman who has managed a household on very little and knows what it tells you. Mrs. Burnett answered both questions, the second with more latitude than the first. Maria noted where the sheets were worn and said so, and suggested darning rather than replacement for the minor tears. And the economy of this was not lost on a woman who had been watching linen wasted. Under the previous regime, it took 2 weeks. Then, one evening toward the end of November, Maria came down to the kitchen for hot water at 9 o'clock. She had established early that she would fetch her own hot water if it was not inconvenient, rather than ringing for Poll at that hour. And Mrs. Burnett was still at the kitchen table with the account books, and a cold cup of tea, and the look of someone too tired to find the stairs. Maria put the kettle on herself. She made 2 cups. She sat down at the table. "My son," Mrs. Burnett said, after a while, with no preceding sentence, "was at Waterloo. He was a foot soldier, sergeant by the end." She looked at the kitchen table. "They wrote me in August. He was 23. Maria said nothing. She did not say she was sorry. Mrs. Burnett had heard sorry from everyone for 11 years, and it had long since ceased to carry any weight. She sat her hand briefly on the table between them, an inch from Mrs. Burnett's, and left it there. And Mrs. Burnett looked at it for a moment, and then turned her cup in its saucer. "The late Duke," she said, "died in November of last year. In the study. We found him the next morning." A pause. "We did not hear. He had been in the study since the afternoon, and we did not think to. There was no bell rung, and we did not think to look." The keys on the chatelaine made a small sound as she shifted in her chair. This house was that cold. Maria looked around the kitchen, which was the warmest room in the house by the simple virtue of the range, and thought about what it meant to measure a house's temperature in those terms. "It will not be that cold again," she said. It was not a grand promise. It was a plain statement of intention. Mrs. Burnett looked at her for the first time with an expression that was not quite trust, but was the room adjacent to it. "No, Your Grace," she said. "I believe it will not." On the 1st of December, Maria moved the dining table 6 feet closer to the fire. It required Thomas and William and a degree of furniture rearrangement that Thomas at least found philosophically troubling. But the result was that the room became, for the first time in Maria's experience of it, a room in which 2 people could sit and eat and be within conversational distance of both each other and the fire, which she considered a reasonable minimum. She opened the music room on the 5th and placed a vase of holly on the pianoforte. The instrument had been kept in tune out of some habit of the late Duke's, or perhaps Mrs. Burnett's stubbornness. When Maria pressed a single key, the note rang true in the cold air of the room, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the lid and thought about that. The holly was from the kitchen garden hedge, cut with her own shears, dark leaves and a clutch of red berries. Nothing formal about it, but it placed the room in the present tense. She found Roland in the library on the 12th. She had not been planning to rearrange it. She had gone for a book and had been standing among the shelves, looking at the two leather armchairs that faced opposite walls, like two people in an argument neither could remember starting, and had thought, "This is wrong." So she had moved them, one chair at a time, which was harder than she expected, the leather old and heavy, until they faced the fire, at the angle she had always thought two chairs in a library ought to face. She looked up when she heard him in the doorway. "This room was designed for solitude," she said. "I thought it might do with conversation." He crossed the room without speaking and sat in the chair beside hers. And that was all. The fire crackled and the wood settled, and the water stain on the northwest ceiling looked, at this angle, a little less like whatever country she had never been able to identify. They read for an hour, or she did. He sat with a book open in his lap, and after a while she was aware, by some alteration in his breathing, that he had fallen asleep. She let him. She turned a page quietly and did not move until the fire needed tending. He told her at breakfast the next morning, with the halting precision of a man unused to announcing private things. "I slept," he said, "the whole night." He looked at his cup. "It has been some years since that was unremarkable." He paused. "I thought you should know." She poured him more tea. "Good," she said. He nodded. They finished their breakfast without ceremony, which was its own kind of remark. On the winter solstice, they walked the estate. The snow had come properly the night before, 4 inches that covered the lawns and orchard, and the kitchen garden, and the lower meadow, in a surface of unmarked white that caught the cold morning light and held it. Their boots crunched in the same rhythm as they crossed the orchard, and Maria could see the dark shapes of the hives ahead. 8 of them, each wrapped in hessian against the cold, looking in the snow like small brown figures gathered in conference. She walked to the nearest one and put her hand against the wrapping, feeling for the faint warmth within. It was there. She had wrapped them herself 3 weeks ago, each binding a specific width and tied with a specific knot, and they had held through 2 frosts already. "They are well?" Roland said beside her. "For now. The winter cluster will hold until February at the earliest." She checked the second hive, then the third. "In spring they will need feeding before the first forage opens." He stood watching her work through the hives in sequence, unhurried, knowing each one. When she reached the last and straightened, he was at her shoulder. He did not speak for a moment. Then he reached out and touched the hessian of the final hive, just his fingers, briefly, against the rough fabric, and then he took her hand, the way a man might reach for something he is not entirely sure he is permitted to hold. And he did not say anything, and she did not pull away. They stood in the snow among the wrapped hives, with the winter solstice light flat and silver above the orchard, and the cold was not unpleasant, and the estate lay around them under its first clean covering of the season. There was a letter on the hall table when they came in, dusted in snow from the post-rider's bag and addressed in the formal hand of a London solicitor. The first of the correspondence regarding the Duke's obligations for the spring season, and the question, implicit in every line of its stiff chancery script, of whether the new Duchess of Eastmere would be presented to the society that had not yet decided what to make of her. The road to London in late March was a study in mud and optimism. The hedgerows beginning their tentative green, the fields soft with the particular vulnerability of recently thawed ground, and the post road running between them in a state of enthusiasm about spring that the carriage wheels did not share. They made slow time from Northwind, stopping twice for the horses and once at an inn in Stony Stratford, where the coffee was adequate and the fire not yet lit despite the morning cold. And Maria sat across from Roland in the coach and watched the countryside relinquish its winter colours, and thought about all the years she had not travelled farther south than Coventry. She had brought 3 dresses, the green wool from the wedding now serving as a travelling gown, a grey silk she had had remade from the original, which had been purchased a decade ago on the occasion of her cousin Henry's wedding, and had since been stored in lavender, until the fabric had developed a faint ghost of that scent that no amount of airing had fully dispelled. And the good one, a deep blue grosgrain that Lady Sibylla had pressed upon her from a trunk of her own things, not as charity, she had made clear, but as a practical matter, since a duchess presenting herself to London in an altered morning gown would reflect poorly on the whole enterprise, and Lady Sibylla had never permitted anything she was associated with to reflect poorly. The grosgrain had been let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulder, and the sleeves altered to the current fashion, and Mrs. Burnett had done the work herself in the fortnight before their departure, with a precision that suggested she had made similar modifications before and found them entirely beneath commentary. Maria wore her mother's earrings, 2 small garnets, old-fashioned, in simple gold settings darkened with age, which she had kept wrapped in a handkerchief in the corner of the blue china cup that held the miscellaneous small objects of her dressing table. They were not impressive jewellery, they were hers, and she wore them because they were the only ornament she owned outright and without history of compromise, and she needed that, going into a city that would assess her. Roland watched her across the carriage for much of the journey without appearing to do so, which was a quality she had noticed in him and attributed to long campaigns where observation had been a matter of survival rather than curiosity. He was tense in the way of a man returning to a territory he has reasons to find unwelcoming, not afraid, but readied. London, she gathered, had been the scene of several financial unpleasantries attendant on the late Duke's estate, and the social obligations of the season were not ones he would have sought out independently. But a Duke who absented himself from the spring season in his first year was a Duke inviting a certain kind of speculation, and both of them understood this. She looked out the window as they crossed into the northern outskirts and the fields gave way to the pressed-together terraces of the city's edge, and she observed that she had forgotten how much of London was noise. Not just sound, the beat and crash of carts, the calls of vendors, the gutter roar of 10,000 daily transactions, but the particular noise of density itself, the sense of being inside a mechanism too large to see whole. Their house in Grosvenor Street had been opened by the London staff 3 days prior, a skeleton of 4, plus Perkins, who had come up ahead to manage the transition with his characteristic efficiency. The drawing room smelled of new beeswax polish and old upholstery. The windows overlooked a street that was already in continuous motion. Maria stood in the first-floor hallway and listened to the city and felt, for the first time since winter, that she was at a distance from everything she understood. She did not dwell on it. She unpacked her own trunk, declined the assistance of the parlour-maid who came to offer it, and then went downstairs and asked Perkins to show her the house from the basement up. The first week of calls was instructive. There is a specific language spoken in London drawing rooms, and it is not the language of what is being said. Maria had known this in the abstract, from her father's books and her sister's letters, and the general intelligence of a woman who reads widely and has had 20 years to think about it. Knowing it in the abstract did not fully prepare her for the version practiced at full proficiency, which was a language of timing and register, and the loaded neutral question that means exactly what it is not saying. She was assessed with great efficiency. Within 4 days of their first calls, she understood the rough shape of what was being thought. A Duke of 44, decorated, eligible, had returned from a decade abroad and come into an estate, and had married, with improbable haste, a beekeeper from the Midlands of 42 with no connections, no fortune, no beauty in the particular mode currently admired, and no apparent explanation. The conclusion of the drawing rooms was not yet hostile. It was that category of suspension that would resolve itself in either direction depending on how she behaved, which was in itself a form of judgment she found moderately exhausting. She behaved with perfect composure. which she was able to do because composure under scrutiny was not, for Maria Oakridge, a performance. It was what she had been practicing since she was 22, in a cottage with a cold fireplace, in a district that respected but did not see her. She had nothing to learn from these rooms about how to be invisible. The question was whether she wished to remain so. She did not. At a card party at the house of Lady Everton, a fine Cavendish Square drawing room whose walls held a set of Dutch landscapes in heavy frames and whose hostess held a set of opinions in even heavier ones, Maria won 2 rubbers of whist through the application of arithmetic and attention, which generated a small buzz of bemused respect from the 4 players at her table. She did not press the advantage, but she did not decline it. She was beginning to understand the territory. It was at this same party that she first saw Lady Clara Vane. She was standing near the window with a group of 3, and she was the one the eye went to. Not because she was the most beautiful. She was striking rather than beautiful, pale-haired and thin-faced, with high cheekbones and eyes of an unusual grey-green that assessed everything they landed on with the swift, invisible calculation of someone who has been adding up rooms for a long time. She was 28, a widow of 2 years' standing. Her late husband, a baronet, who had left debts and a house in Hampshire that she had been obliged to let. She wore her clothes with the specific authority of a woman who has had a great deal and is managing on considerably less, but has not permitted anyone to notice the management. Maria knew who she was before Roland's social secretary's careful briefing the following morning. Lady Sibylla had mentioned her name once, in a tone that contained a footnote she had not elaborated. What Maria did not yet know was that Lady Clara's late father, Colonel Hugh Vane, had been the man named in Delphine's forged letter. The supposed connection Roland had formed abroad, the fiction around which the entire betrayal had been constructed. Lady Clara herself knew nothing of this. She had been a child of 8 when the letter was written, and her father had died in the peninsula 12 years ago, and the particular use made of his name had not reached her in any form she could have identified. She resented Maria on entirely different grounds. Roland had been, before his return, the most eligible man on the horizon of her particular calculations, and she had spent 8 months positioning herself for that horizon. And Maria had appeared in the way of something she had not seen coming. She opened her campaign that same week, in the soft, precise way of someone who has done this before and knows that the most durable damage is done by people who appear to be helping. The rumour she began circulating was not a single story, it was 3, modulated for different audiences. At Almack's, among the young matrons, it was a rumour of barrenness and obligation. The Duke had been pressured into the match by a question of an old attachment made inconveniently public, and it was already understood in certain circles that the title would pass to Gervase Ashby, the cousin, since there would be no heir. At the card tables of the older men, it was a question of judgment. Had the Duke not been compromised by whatever had occurred in the country, and was it not a concern that a man of his responsibilities should allow himself to be managed by a woman of no standing? Among the young women, the version was softer and more devastating, that he had married her out of pity, that he found the arrangement as surprising as anyone, that he had been seen in conversation with Lady Clara herself on 3 recent occasions, which last was true, since London's social calendar generated conversations one had not sought. Maria was aware of this within a fortnight. Not because she was told, no one told her, because no one had yet decided whether she was worth the candour or the risk, but because she could read a room, and rooms have their own grammar. A particular slowing of conversation when she entered. A particular quality in certain smiles. The way a woman at Almack's had touched her own ring while looking at Maria's plain gold band, and then looked away. She read it all, and she filed it. And she was not, she discovered, frightened by it in the way she might have expected to be. She was, instead, precise about it. The way she was precise about a building survey that did not add up. The dinner party at Lord and Lady Farley's on the 14th was a table of 18 in a room that smelled of hot candles and French polish, and the particular tension of 18 people who know one another too well and not well enough simultaneously. Maria sat 7 places from Roland, the formal arrangement that separated spouses, and 3 from Lady Clara Vane, who had been placed with either ignorance or malice by a hostess Maria had not yet been able to fully read. The conversation at the table had been running on the subject of country estates and their management, which had given Maria several opportunities to speak with precision and had generated 2 exchanges with the gentleman to her left, a Colonel Ashe, retired, who kept a farm in Shropshire and found her knowledge of drainage genuinely interesting. That she had enjoyed. It was when the conversation turned, inevitably, to the seasonal pursuits of the district that Lady Clara spoke. She leaned forward slightly, directing her remark toward Maria with the warm, inquiring air of someone moved purely by sociable curiosity. "I wonder, Your Grace, do you find the bees of town at all agreeable, compared to those of the country?" The table did not quite fall silent, but it tilted in that direction. 18 people managed, without appearing to reduce their own conversation to a murmur to allow the exchange to carry. Maria looked at Lady Clara across the candles. She took no particular time about it. "The bees of London are kept in hives," she said, "and produce honey of indifferent quality. But then I have observed that the quality of the hive is often reflected in the product." The silence this time was complete, and had a different texture to it than the preceding one. Colonel Ashe, to her left, made a sound that was plausibly a cough. The gentleman across from Lady Clara pressed his mouth together in the way of a man maintaining control over an expression he has formed an opinion about. Lady Clara's colour rose, a thin, precise flush along the cheekbones, and she reached for her wineglass with a hand that was perfectly steady, which told Maria she had encountered the type before. The kind of woman who absorbs a cheque with composure and adds it to an account she intends to settle. Roland, 7 places down, had heard. Maria did not look at him to confirm this, but she was aware of him in the way she was aware of most significant things in a room. Peripherally, accurately. She would not have wanted his rescue, and he did not offer it, which suggested he understood her well enough to know this. What she saw, in the brief moment she allowed herself to glance toward him, was not satisfaction, or amusement, or any expression that belonged to spectacle. It was something quieter and more complicated. The face of a man watching someone he knows to be competent demonstrate it in a new field, with a particular quality of attention that had nothing performing about it. The dinner continued. The conversation moved on as London conversation always does, unwilling to dwell on anything too long when there are so many other things to be briefly interested in. Delphine's letter arrived at Grosvenor Street on a Tuesday, which Maria knew only because Tuesday was the day Perkins sorted the post and placed it in the order she had established. Estate matters first, personal correspondence second, social invitations third, everything else below. Delphine's letter was in the personal correspondence pile in Delphine's hand, or rather, the version of Delphine's hand that she deployed for formal occasions, more upright than her ordinary script, the capitals a little exaggerated. It was sealed with plain wax. Maria stood in the morning room, turned it over once, looked at the seal, and put it in the grate. She watched it catch, the paper curling and browning and then going to black. The wax left a small, bright bead of red among the ash. She did not need to read it. She knew Delphine's range of correspondence as one knows the repertoire of a musician who plays only 3 pieces. There would be false warmth. There would be an inquiry disguised as congratulation. And there would be something toward the end that was not quite a threat. Something in the conditional tense. Something that required an awareness of a shared history to decode. She had been receiving variations on that letter for 20 years. She did not intend to receive them for the next 20. What she had not anticipated was that Delphine had written twice. The second letter, which she learned of 10 days later, not from Delphine and not from Perkins, but from the expression on the face of a woman at a morning call who had thought better of saying something, and in thinking better of it, had said it anyway, had gone elsewhere. Not to Grosvenor Street, somewhere between the post office and the house, or before it had reached the post office at all, it had come into different hands. And those hands, by the account Maria was now piecing together, were pale-fingered and belonged to a woman with grey-green eyes who had recently been seen in conversation with Delphine's daughter Lucy at a circulating library. She did not have the letter's contents. She did not yet know precisely what Delphine had confessed to in the carelessness of her own self-justification, or what use was being made of it, or in what form it would arrive. She only knew that it existed, that it had been read by someone with a use for it, and that somewhere in London a second move was being prepared in a game whose board she had only just begun to see in its full dimensions. The question was not whether Lady Clara would play it. The question was where, and when, and whether Maria would have sufficient advance notice to choose her own ground. The intelligence reached Maria on a Thursday by the most reliable channel available to her in London. Not gossip, which she had learned to read but not entirely trust, and not the formal morning call, which had its own specific distortions, but Mrs. Burnett, who had a sister in service in Mayfair, and who had come to Maria's dressing room with the particular expression of a woman who has weighed what she knows against what she owes, and has made a decision about both. "The Richmond ball," Mrs. Burnett said. "Saturday evening." She set Maria's comb down on the dressing table with a small, precise click, as though punctuating the sentence. "My sister's mistress had a letter from a friend who was present at a tea on Wednesday. Lady Clara Vane has something written. She has been showing it selectively since Tuesday. My sister could not say what it contains, but she heard the word criminal used in connection with your name, and the phrase deceived husband. She looked at Maria in the glass rather than directly, which was a courtesy. I thought you should know before Saturday." Maria looked at her own reflection. The garnet earrings caught the morning light. Two small, dark points, old-fashioned, neither modest nor ornate, exactly what they were. She thought of the handkerchief corner they had lived in for 20 years, the blue china cup on the cottage dressing table, the 7 miles between that room and this one. "Thank you, Hester," she said. She used the name without thinking. Mrs. Burnett did not correct her, and in the mirror her expression altered by a degree too small to name. She told Roland that evening. They were in the drawing-room after dinner, not yet accustomed enough to London evenings to fill them without effort, still carrying the rhythms of Northwind, where evenings had the natural occupation of cold and quiet, and the companionable work of a fire. He was standing at the window with a glass of port he had not been drinking when she came in. She told him plainly, and in the order she had assembled it, Delphine's second letter, the circulating library, Mrs. Burnett's sister, the Richmond ball on Saturday. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You knew about the second letter," he said. "For some weeks. I knew it existed. I did not know its contents, and I still do not." She sat in the chair by the fire, not the armchairs of Northwind which she had placed herself, but a spindly gilt thing that served its purpose, and looked at him. "I burned the first one without reading it. If I had read it, I might have known what was in the second. I chose not to, and I will not pretend otherwise." "What does she say in it?" He crossed to the other chair. "Your best inference. That she forged the letters. She has confessed to it in writing before, to me, to Henry, once to a curate in a fit of evangelical conscience that was over by the following Sunday. She enjoys the confession when she believes the audience is contained. Maria looked at the fire. She will not have expected the audience to expand. She will be in some distress, I imagine, when she understands what she has set in motion. And Vane intends to use a confession of forgery to imply a criminal connection on your part. People hear what they are prepared to hear. She will not need to argue her interpretation. She will simply read it aloud in a room full of people who already have their doubts about me, and let the room do the rest. He was quiet again. She could see him thinking, which was a thing she had come to recognize over the months of their marriage. A particular stillness that was not passivity, but the opposite. The stillness of a man whose mind is moving very fast and who has learned not to let the body betray it. He had worn that quality in the estate room with Soames, and in the Golden Lane, and in the library when he was not reading. She found she liked it, the same way she liked a well-made tool, the function visible in the form. He wore, on the mantelpiece beside him, the ribbon of his campaign decoration. He had brought it out for the more formal calls, and left it on the mantelpiece in the drawing room as one sets down something one is not sure how to carry inside. It was a narrow ribbon of dark blue and gold, attached to a small piece of figured brass, and it looked plain and well worn, which it was, and she had never asked him about it, and he had not offered, and it sat there now between them, with 20 years of his life in it. "I am not afraid of the ball," she said. "I know you are not." He looked at her with that expression she had still not fully catalogued, the one that had been present in the lane, in the library, on the solstice walk among the hives, and he said, "I would like, if you will allow it, to handle this in my own way." She considered him. "That depends on what your way is." "The truth," he said, "simply told." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Then yes." And that was all. The Duchess of Richmond's London house in Piccadilly opened its ballroom on Saturday evening to perhaps 240 guests, and the room itself was equal to the occasion. 3 tiers of chandeliers burning above a floor polished to a reflection. The walls hung in pale gold damask that absorbed the candlelight and gave it back warmer. The air already thick with perfume and heat, by 9 o'clock, when Maria and Roland arrived. The Duchess herself, a woman of 50, with the upright carriage of someone who has spent decades being looked at and has made her peace with it, received them at the head of the stairs with the smooth courtesy she deployed equally for everyone, which was a kind of fairness, even if it was not warmth. The ballroom had 2 sets of tall French doors open onto the garden, and the night outside was cool for late spring, and the curtains at the doors moved in the breeze that came through, so that the room breathed. Maria stood near the first set of doors for a time, watching the room fill, cataloguing it the way she catalogued everything. The geography of it, where the small groups had formed, and on what apparent basis, who stood close to whom, and who kept a particular distance from a particular doorway. She wore the deep blue grosgrain and her mother's earrings, and she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and held it and did not drink it. Colonel Ashe found her near the orchestra's intermission and spoke of his Shropshire drainage project, which had progressed since their dinner party conversation, and she was genuinely glad to hear about it, and they talked for 10 minutes with the ease of people who have found a shared register and are comfortable in it. He had brought his daughter, a girl of 20 named Harriet, who stood at his side and watched the room with round, good-natured eyes, and had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't watching it. Maria liked her immediately. She liked honest observation. Roland moved through the room in the way he moved through most rooms, without urgency, without apparent agenda, speaking to people as they presented themselves. She watched him from her position near the doors and thought about what he had said. The truth, simply told. She had known men of his type before. Her father had been one, in his quiet way, and she knew that the phrase was not a comfort. It was a statement of method. He meant it, and she did not doubt him, and that was the part that was keeping her very still. Lady Clara arrived at 9:30 with a small party that included, Maria noted, a woman she recognised as the wife of one of the Almack's patrons, a connection that meant her entrance would be observed, and her behaviour this evening would carry the particular authority of the socially certified. She was dressed in white silk with a silver overdress, and she looked, objectively, spectacular, in the way of someone who has understood that spectacle is a tool and has spent several hours applying it precisely. She caught Maria's eye from across the room and held the contact for a moment, not hostile, not warm, simply confirming that the evening was proceeding on the schedule she had planned, and then she looked away. It happened after supper. The company had moved back to the ballroom from the supper room, and the second dancing set was being formed, and the room was in the particular fluid state between one activity and the next, when people are moving and grouping, and the general attention is nowhere fixed. It was into this fluidity that Lady Clara moved. She had positioned herself near the centre of the room, where the light from the closest chandelier was best, and the sight lines were clearest. And she had around her a group of perhaps 15 people, some of whom had come with her, and some of whom had simply drifted as people drift toward a point of gathering. She produced the letter from the small silver reticule at her wrist. The movement was casual, and she said something to the woman beside her. Maria could not hear it from where she stood, 20 feet away. And then she raised her voice to the volume of a woman sharing something amusing, which is precisely the volume that carries furthest in a ballroom that has briefly stopped its music. "I wonder," she said, in that warm and curious tone Maria had heard before, "whether the assembly might find it instructive to hear something that has recently come into my possession." 15 people became 30. The music had not yet resumed. The room did not freeze all at once. It gathered, the way cold does, from the edges. Maria stood very still. The garnet earrings were small and warm at her ears. She was aware of Roland, who was 8 feet to her left, and of the fact that he was already turning. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Lady Clara. Lady Clara opened the letter. Her voice, when she began to read, was even and clear, and she read only the passage she had chosen, a section of Delphine's letter in which her sister had written, in the self-dramatizing syntax she brought to all her private confessions, that she had done what was necessary, that Maria had never been suited to what was being discussed, and that any man of position would come to understand this in time, since certain women were made for certain stations and could not rise above them without a ruin they brought upon themselves. The word criminal was not in the passage. Lady Clara did not need it to be. The implication was assembled from what was present, the way a silhouette is assembled from its own absence of light. The room was quiet with the quality of a room that has decided to remain so. Maria said nothing. She was white, she knew. She could feel it in the specific way colour leaves the face, a drawing in rather than a rush. But she stood upright, and her hands were still at her sides, and she kept her eyes on Lady Clara with the even patience of someone who has waited for a very long time for something to be finished. Then Roland moved. He crossed the space between them in 8 steps, and the room moved with him. Not literally, but its attention did, which was the same thing. He held out his hand to Lady Clara with the courtesy of a man who has not misplaced his manners, but intends something different than courtesy. And after a moment that held some specific social pressure, she placed the letter in it. He read it. The whole of it. Not only the passage she had read aloud. Standing there in the centre of the room with 200 people watching, he read to the end. And then he folded it. And he put it in his coat. And he looked at the assembly. "I will tell you what this letter is," he said. His voice carried without effort, a voice trained to carry over field noise, over confusion, to reach the specific person who needed to hear it. It is a letter from my wife's sister, written in the self-interest that has characterized her conduct for 23 years. He paused. 23 years ago, this same woman forged 2 letters. One told Maria that I had released her from our understanding. One told me that she had released me. We each believed ourselves abandoned by the other's choice. And we each conducted the following 20 years accordingly, separately, believing ourselves forgotten. He looked at the room steadily. Neither of us was faithless. We were deceived by one person, who found our attachment inconvenient. The silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of an audience waiting for scandal. It was a different quality of attention, heavier, less comfortable. The attention of people who have been expecting one thing and are receiving another. I have been a soldier in the field, Roland said, and I have known courage of a particular kind. The kind tested in moments, under fire, in situations whose terror is acute and whose resolution is swift. I have never known it like I know it in a woman who came back to an empty cottage after 20 years of believing herself abandoned, and built a life of use and dignity from that ground. He looked directly at Maria for the first time since he had begun speaking. She kept bees. She tended the sick. She minded the ground of a district while I was abroad. And she did not break. And she did not diminish herself. And when I came back, she received me in her garden with earth on her hands and gave me not an inch that I had not earned. He turned back to the room. She is my wife. She is the best thing I have done with the half of my life that was worth anything. I will hear no word against her. He did not shout it. He did not perform it. He said it in the plain voice of a man making a plain record. The room was very still. Lady Clara Vane stood 6 feet from him with the silver reticule at her wrist and the white silk dress and the spectacular entrance she had constructed over weeks of careful preparation. And she was alone in the way that a person becomes alone when the room they are standing in turns its face away. It was not dramatic. No one said anything to her. No one expelled her. People simply found, in the next few minutes, that they had things to discuss with others, and the conversations that formed did not include her, and the ones that were already formed did not open to admit her. The Colonel's daughter Harriet, who had been standing 3 feet from Lady Clara at the moment Roland began speaking, had moved to her father's side with a small, specific step that was not rude and was not ambiguous. Roland walked to Maria. He took her hand the way he had taken it on the winter solstice among the hives. Not ceremonially, not as a gesture for the room, but as a man who has decided on something and is enacting his decision. She felt the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of it, and the 20 years of separate winters between them. And none of it was said, and all of it was understood. And she kept her face composed, and met the room's attention with the same level gaze she had brought to every room that had ever looked at her and not seen what she was. He led her toward the French doors. The night air came in cool and carrying the smell of the garden, cut grass, and something faintly sweet, late blooming, and she breathed it. Behind them, the orchestra resumed. The room reordered itself with the adaptability of rooms that have witnessed worse and have learned to flow around any given event. Outside on the terrace, in the dark and the cool, she let out the breath she had been holding since 9:30. He did not say anything. He stood beside her at the stone balustrade, and they looked at the garden below, where the lanterns had been lit along the paths, and their reflections sat in the ornamental water at the garden's centre, broken and reformed by the small wind. She was aware very precisely of his hand still holding hers, and of the city all around them, its noise, its smell of coal smoke and horse, and the specific pressure of its density, and of how different it was from a snow-covered orchard and 8 hives wrapped in hessian, and how much she wanted, she discovered, to go home. She would say it to him tomorrow, in the carriage, or perhaps tonight in the drawing room, over the cold port she would drink, now that the evening was over. The season had run its course, or enough of it. The question was not whether to leave London. That answer was settled in her chest as clearly as anything had ever been. But how soon they could arrange it, and whether the northbound road would be as muddy in June as it had been in March, and whether Mrs. Burnett had thought to begin feeding the hives. They left London on the 18th of June. The city did not release them graciously. The northern road was clogged through Islington with market carts, and it was mid-morning before the buildings thinned enough to let the sky have any room. And another hour before Maria felt the specific loosening that comes when a large and pressing thing falls behind you, and the air changes character. She sat in the coach and watched London diminish through the back glass, and thought nothing in particular, which was itself a luxury she had not had since March. By Dunstable, the hedgerows were in full June extravagance, elder flowering white along every verge, the hayfields standing tall on either side of the road, the scent of them flooding the carriage whenever the window was let down, which Roland kept it, because she had asked him to, and because he had learned, over the months of their marriage, to read the difference between what she asked for and what she was content to go without. These were not the same category, and the distinction mattered to her, and he had noticed that it mattered. She had noticed him noticing, and had found she was glad of it, and had not said so, because some things are more precisely communicated by allowing them to continue than by naming them. They slept one night in Northampton at an inn whose mattress was superior to its carpets, and drove the final stretch the following morning through country that was, unmistakably, theirs. The particular flatness of the upper meadows giving way to the small hills, the elm at the Coventry Road corner, its ruts worse than ever and requiring the coachman's full attention, and then the lane between the lime trees and the sound of the gravel of North Wind's drive under the wheels. The house looked different in June. Maria had not been prepared for how different. She had known North Wind first in grey November and through winter, and into a London spring she had carried the house in her memory as a cold thing, stone and dust sheeting and the smell of absent years. What met her now, stepping out of the carriage into the long morning light of a June day, was something else entirely. The south wall was covered in roses that had apparently been doing this every summer for 30 years, without any encouragement from the late Duke or anyone else. A climbing variety she did not immediately recognise, pink in the open flowers, deeper at the bud, running from the library window to the corner of the east wing, in a mass that smelled, from 10 feet away, of a sweetness thick enough to hold. The lawn beyond the formal garden had gone long in patches. Perkins had made certain judgments about ground staff priorities and had made them correctly. But under the lime trees it was cropped short and cool and green, and the kitchen garden behind the east wall was producing in the unhurried, confident way of ground that has been properly prepared and then left to proceed. She could hear the bees from the carriage drive. The orchard was behind the north wall, but the sound carried. That specific hum, different from early spring's tentative workings, the full-throated industry of a strong colony in high summer, purposeful and continuous as a mill wheel. She stood and listened to it for a moment before going in. The hall smelled of beeswax polish and cut grass. The windows had been left open at the back of the house, and it was warm in the way of rooms that have been letting the sun in all morning. The dust sheets were gone from the drawing room and the blue salon. Mrs. Burnett had, apparently, taken their imminent return as an occasion for a reorganisation of the entire ground floor that had involved William and Thomas and at least 2 days of sustained effort, because the rooms were clean in a way that was recent and thorough and slightly aggressive. Mrs. Burnett herself received Maria in the hall with the contained welcome of a woman who has been looking forward to something for several weeks and has had time to prepare the correct expression. She gave her account of the household in the concise manner she brought to all reporting. The new kitchen maid was settling, the linen had all been aired, the library ceiling was mended. This last she said with a satisfaction she did not bother to modulate. Greer went over the whole roof in April, she said. New plaster still showed pale in the northwest corner of the library ceiling, Maria found when she went to look. A cleaner white than the old, the repair larger than the water stain it replaced. The lead flashing outside the window, now straight and true. She stood in the library doorway and looked at it, and then at the two armchairs still facing the fire exactly as she had placed them in December, and at the gap in the bookshelves, where Roland had apparently spent some of the winter reading, and at the holly vase on the music room's pianoforte, which had been removed and replaced with a blue glazed jug of sweet peas that someone, Mrs. Burnett, she suspected, had cut fresh from the walled garden. Greer was the new steward, a Staffordshire man of 38 named James Greer, recommended by Colonel Ashe, who had managed the Shropshire farm for 6 years and arrived at Northwind in February with a surveyor's habit of mind and the particular quality of a man who finds a problem not distressing, but interesting. He had, in 4 months, relet 2 tenancies that had been empty since the previous autumn, begun the drainage work in the lower field, and produced accounts that agreed with one another, which was a quality Maria had come to regard as a baseline requirement, and which she appreciated with a fervour that would have surprised him if she had said so, which she did not. Lucy's letter was waiting on the hall table, posted 3 weeks prior, and arrived the week before them. Maria read it that evening in the drawing room, and then again more slowly, noting the things Lucy mentioned in passing without quite presenting them as the things they were. Delphine had, since the events of the Richmond ball, which had reached the Midlands in the particular form news travels when it involves someone locally known, simultaneously exaggerated and accurate, removed herself to Bath, where she had a friend from her school days and where the social scale was slightly different. Henry remained at home and was managing, which Lucy wrote with the carefully neutral tone of a girl who loves her father and has stopped expecting her mother to be anything other than what she is. The young man Lucy was considering was a solicitor's son in Ashwick, whose name was Thomas Peel, and who had walked her home from the market twice and carried her basket without being asked. Maria read this passage twice, and then put the letter in the drawer of the writing desk, which was where she kept the things she intended to return to. She did not intend to return to Delphine. She felt this not as a decision, but as an established fact. The kind of thing you discover rather than choose. The way you discover the root of a problem in a set of accounts. It was always true, and you have simply arrived at the number. Delphine had written the letters and had, 23 years later, written a letter that confessed to them, and both the writing and the confessing were entirely consistent with a person Maria had known her whole life and had spent a very long time grieving. The grieving was finished. The account was closed. She said none of this to Roland. She simply carried the drawer closed and came back to her chair by the window, where the evening was doing something remarkable to the roses on the south wall. The light at 7 o'clock in June captures colour differently than at any other hour, and the roses were so deeply pink they were almost red. And the air coming in from the garden was the compound smell of a whole day's heat released from stone and earth and leaf. He looked up from his book. She sat down. "All well?" he said. "All well," she said, and meant it in the plain and comprehensive sense. It was Roland who asked, on a morning in late July, if he might come to the hives. He asked it at breakfast, over the toast and the good honey, the spring batch, lighter than autumn, almost translucent in the jar, with the particular care of someone who knows they are asking permission for a thing and wants to ask for it correctly. She looked at him across the table and found that she was pleased, which she noted and did not announce. "There are some things to know before you go near them," she said. "I expected there would be." She told him over the remainder of breakfast and the walk to the orchard. The veil, the correct movement, slow, no sudden reach, the smell of smoke and what it did. The difference between a colony that is defensive and one that is simply busy. And the fact that the bees knew her and did not yet know him, and that this was information they would take into account. He listened with the attention he brought to everything she knew that he didn't, which was an attention without performance, the quiet, whole attention of a man who is actually absorbing rather than managing the appearance of absorbing. She had married, she had come to understand, a man who had spent 20 years in a profession that punished the gap between these two things severely, and it had made him very good at the real version. The hives in late July were at their peak. The colony of the largest, the one nearest the north wall of the orchard, which had been a package of her own Midland bees brought from the cottage in 3 careful trips, in a box packed with lavender, and which had prospered through the winter and expanded hard into spring, held perhaps 60,000 workers. And on a warm morning, the sound was not the comfortable hum of cooler months, but something denser, more layered, the whole colony in the continuous business of capping the last of the summer nectar. She suited him up in the spare veil and showed him how to stand. He stood correctly on the first attempt, which she had half expected, that particular combination of self-discipline and spatial intelligence that meant his body did what he told it to, and told it accurately. She lit the smoker. She worked the near hive methodically, showing him what she was doing and why as she did it, the movement of the frames, the read of the brood pattern, the inspection for signs of the summer's late-stage preparations. "They expel the drones," she said, lifting a frame to show him, "in late summer. The workers remove them from the colony before the nectar flow closes. The drones have served their purpose." She turned the frame slowly in the light. "They are thorough about it." "How long does it take?" "A week, sometimes 2. They are patient, but they do not reconsider." He looked at the frame, the specific amber geometry of the capped cells, the smaller pattern of the brood, the bees moving in their purposeful and indifferent tens of thousands, with an expression she read as genuine absorption rather than courtesy. She handed in the frame, showing him the grip, and he held it steadily, not gripping tight, not letting it tip. The same quality of care in his hands that he brought to anything he was trusted with. The August heat held through the next 3 weeks, unusual for the Midlands, and the bees worked the clover and the late linden into the last full supers of the season. On a Thursday afternoon, in the last week of August, Maria went to the hives in the early evening to assess the final harvest. The late season batch, the one with the dark, complex quality of mixed summer sauces, which she had always thought the best of the year and the hardest to describe, because it tasted of everything that had grown since May and nothing specific. She had a new jar waiting on the kitchen windowsill, labelled in her own hand on a strip of paper cut square. North Wind. Late summer, 1820. The first time that word, North Wind, appeared in her handwriting on anything she had made herself. The light at that hour in late August was not October's heavy amber. It was something thinner and hotter. The summer burning at its last intensity before the turn. The sun low enough to come in flat and warm through the orchard trees and touch everything it landed on with a quality of attention that would not last much longer. The grass between the hives was long and slightly dry, the first hint of the season's edge. She heard him come through the orchard gate. He had brought his coat off and his sleeves rolled, which was the adjustment he had made to warm weather hive work after the second time he came with her. And he carried the spare veil over one arm. He came to stand beside her at the largest hive without announcement, and she made room for him without looking up, and they settled into the side-by-side silence that had become, without either of them having arranged it, the natural register of work done together. She lifted a frame. The last frame of the last super. Heavy with capped late summer comb, the wax pale at the caps and amber where the honey showed through the uncapped cells at the edge. The whole frame warm from the body heat of the colony and from the August light. And the smell of it was the concentrated smell of everything the summer had been. Every flower in the district, every warm morning, the clover in the lower meadow and the linden along the kitchen garden wall, and something underneath both of them that was simply the smell of the season itself, distilled. Roland reached out and touched the comb with one finger. The pad of his finger rested against the wax cap of a single cell, gently, with the unhurried attention he had learned in 7 weeks of standing beside her at the hives. And then he turned his hand and touched her cheek, and the warmth of the wax was still in his fingertips. She leaned into his hand. The bees moved around them in their warm, unhurried thousands, indifferent and absolute. And the late August light lay gold across the two of them, and the frame she held, and the orchard, and the long grass, and the whole summer-heavy estate. And nothing else was said.